You are about to cross into a world where fear is real. Real stories, unexplained phenomena, where the supernatural lurks in the shadows. From the portal of dread.
Today's story. The train that never arrived. The family's horror on the haunted track. I have been waiting for you. Welcome to my domain, the portal of dread. Here, each story is not merely a tale, but a portal I open directly to your worst nightmares. With me, fear is not just told, it is felt in the soul. Turn off the light. Lock the door. Let your own breath guide you through the inevitable labyrinth of madness. If you possess the foolish courage to cross this threshold, subscribe to the channel. And to prove your insolence, type in the comments, "I am not afraid." Now, prepare yourself, the unknown is already here. Imagine yourself on a historic train, traversing the verdant mountains of Minas Gerais, with the sun glinting through the dusty windows, the rhythmic clatter of the tracks echoing like a lullaby, and your family by your side, laughing as they point out postcard-perfect landscapes. Odirlei, at 44, a man of imposing presence but with eyes weary from sleepless nights due to work, holds the hand of Natalia, 42, whose expression of relief at finally being on vacation conceals a constant tension, a fear she won't even admit to herself. Valentina, their 13-year-old daughter, leans against the window, headphones blocking out the world, capturing every detail with her camera, while Vittorio, the 10-year-old youngest, bounces from one side of the car to the other, incessantly asking about ghost stories he's heard regarding the region. It's a perfect moment, or at least it should be. But what if, suddenly, this instant of peace were to transform into a nightmare from which you cannot escape? The train connecting Tiradentes to São João del Rei is not merely a relic of the past, a machine of iron and wood that has traversed the mountainous terrain of Minas Gerais since the 19th century. It carries stories that tour guides avoid recounting, whispers of tragedies that locals only mention in hushed tones, as if fearing to awaken something dormant. More than 80% of those who make this journey report experiencing something inexplicable. A chill that isn't from the wind, a heaviness in the chest with no logical explanation, or even the sensation of being watched, even when the car is empty. For most, it's merely a fleeting impression, something forgotten over a cup of coffee upon reaching their destination. But for Odirlei, Natalia, Valentina, and Vittorio, what begins as a slight unease rapidly escalates into a terror that threatens to engulf each of them, body and soul. It all begins with an almost imperceptible detail. Odirlei, seated on one of the wooden benches polished smooth by time, feels a chill that shouldn't be there. The sun still warms the car, but his hands seem to touch invisible ice. He laughs, attempting to mask his discomfort, and remarks to Natalia about the mountain's natural air conditioning, but his voice comes out more strained than he intended. Natalia, always perceptive, she notices the shift in her husband's tone, but her primary concern is Vittorio, who has stopped bouncing and is now staring, wide-eyed, at the train's empty corridor. "Someone's there, Mom," he murmurs, pointing to a space where nothing exists but shadows cast by the light filtering through the windows. Natalia forces a smile, assuring him it's merely imagination, but her heart races as she grips her son's hand with more force than necessary. Valentina, oblivious to the unfolding events around her, continues taking photographs, the camera's click almost muffled by the train's rumble. But as she reviews the images on the viewfinder, something makes her freeze. In one of the shots, a dark blur appears in the corner of the frame, something that wasn't present when she pressed the shutter. She zooms in, her heart quickening, and discerns that the blur vaguely resembles a figure, as if someone were standing right behind her. She glances over her shoulder, but the carriage is empty, save for her family. A shiver runs down her spine, and for the first time that day, she removes her headphones, feeling an acute need for vigilance, though she knows not what for. Meanwhile, the train continues its journey, but the atmosphere within the carriage shifts in an almost palpable manner. The sound of the tracks, previously comforting, now resembles an erratic heartbeat, as if something were attempting to synchronize with its rhythm, but failing. Odirlei, who has always been fascinated by antiquities and the history they embody, begins to feel an odd weight in his jacket pocket. He carries a small artifact he purchased at a local market in Tiradentes, a twisted piece of metal the vendor claimed originated from an old railway accident. At the time, it seemed merely a curiosity, an addition to his collection, but now, each time his hand brushes against the object, he perceives a tingling sensation, as if he were holding something sentient. Natalia, with her analytical pharmacist's mind, attempts to rationalize the unfolding events. Perhaps it's the fatigue from the journey, or maybe the rarefied air at this altitude is affecting everyone. Yet when she gazes at her reflection in the train window, she swears she discerns something stir behind her, something that isn't the outline of her family. She whips around, her heart in her throat, but there's nothing there. Yet, the unsettling feeling of being watched does not dissipate. She pulls Vittorio closer, almost crushing him against her, while her mind screams that she must protect her children, even though she doesn't know from what. Terror begins to seep into the subtle fissures of the family dynamic. Odirlei, who had always striven to be the pillar of strength, feels his confidence waver as low, almost inaudible voices begin to echo in his mind, accusing him of failing as a father, of being absent when it mattered most. He clenches his teeth, attempting to ignore them, but each word slices like a blade. Natalia, whose greatest fear is failing to anticipate danger, feels she is losing control, that something is coming and she has no means to prevent it. Valentina, who already felt invisible within her own family, realizes no one notices her panic as she stares at the figure in her photos, which seems to draw nearer with each successive image. And Vittorio, with his childlike fear of being alone, begins to cry softly, saying that the voice in the corridor is asking him to get off the train, promising that everything will be fine if he complies. The carriage, once a space of laughter and burgeoning memories, is now a stage for silent nightmares. The sun still shines outside, but within the train, darkness seems to expand, as if something were siphoning away the light. The other passengers, few and scattered, appear to notice nothing amiss, which only amplifies the family's isolation. They are alone with whatever entity resides there, something unseen, yet felt by each of them in distinct and equally terrifying ways. Odirlei attempts to rise, contemplating speaking with the conductor, but his legs feel leaden, as if something is tethering him in place. Natalia murmurs a prayer, something she hadn't done since childhood, while holding her children with trembling hands. Valentina, for the first time, speaks aloud, asking if anyone else sees what is in her photos, but her voice is swallowed by the sound of the train, or perhaps by something far more sinister. And then, without warning, the train decelerates, the tracks shrieking as if something were clawing at them from beneath. The lights in the carriage flicker once, twice, and then extinguish entirely, plunging the family into darkness. A suffocating silence descends, broken only by the ragged breathing of each family member. Vittorio sobs, clutching at Mom, while Odirlei feels the artifact in his pocket pulse, as if alive. Natalia hears a whisper behind her, so distinct she could swear someone is there, breathing down her neck. Valentina, camera still in hand, sees a faint light through the viewfinder, but it's not sunlight. It's something red, gleaming in the corner of the carriage. And what if it were you? If your family were trapped on this train, confronting something inexplicable, something that knows your deepest fears and wields them against you? Could you protect your loved ones? Or would you succumb to the terror that seems to grow with each passing second, like a shadow that cannot be outrun? For Odirlei, Natalia, Valentina, and Vittorio, this vacation trip is no longer about forging happy memories. It's about surviving something that may never let them go. The historic train connecting Tiradentes to San Juan del Rey gently rumbles as it traverses the mountains of Minas Gerais, the sound of the tracks echoing like a constant, almost hypnotic heartbeat. Inside one of the aged wooden carriages, burnished by decades of hands and histories, sit Odirlei and Natalia's family, who embarked on this journey with the promise of days of rest and connection. The morning sun streams through the dusty windows, casting golden streaks of light onto the seats. But even in this scene that seems plucked from a painting, a subtle tension permeates the air, a sense that something is amiss, though no one can yet articulate what it is. Each family member carries their own baggage, not merely the suitcases stacked in the corner of the carriage, but also the invisible burdens of their fears, dreams, and regrets, which render them as real as anyone sitting beside them. Odirlei, 44, is a man of robust stature, with hands calloused from years of handling antique objects, an entrepreneur in the antiques business who transformed his passion for history into a livelihood. He possesses a serious, almost austere demeanor, yet his brown eyes hold a glimmer of curiosity whenever he discusses the past. However, beneath this fascination lies a gnawing guilt. He knows his work keeps him away from his family more than he would wish. The nights he arrived late for Valentina's birthday dinner, or the mornings the fact that he wasn't there to take Vittorio to school bears down upon his conscience like stones. This trip is his attempt at atonement, a chance to prove he can be the father and husband they deserve. He smiles as he points out a distant village through the window, recounting a tale of the 19th century railway, but his voice carries a strained undertone, as if he's trying to convince himself that all is well. In his coat pocket, he carries a small, twisted metal artifact, purchased from a local market, something he believes to be merely an innocuous relic, yet which, for some inexplicable reason, feels heavier than it should. Beside him, Natalia, 42, adjusts her thin-framed spectacles, observing her children with a gaze that intertwines affection and apprehension. A pharmacist and nutritionist, she serves as the family's bedrock, a methodical woman who meticulously plans every detail of their lives with an almost obsessive precision. Her brown hair is pulled back into a taut bun, and her hands are never idle, whether tidying Vittorio's backpack or ensuring everyone has water and snacks. Yet beneath this facade of control, Natalia harbors a constant, almost suffocating fear of failing to protect her family. Every piece of news regarding an accident or illness she encounters feels like a personal harbinger, and she blames herself for her inability to anticipate all the world's perils. On this journey, she endeavors to relax, laughing at one of Odirlei's jests about the train being haunted by the specters of delayed passengers. But her laughter is fleeting, and her eyes swiftly return to her children, as if fearing that something might snatch them away at any moment. Valentina, the 13-year-old eldest daughter, sits slightly apart, leaning against the window with headphones enveloping her ears, isolating herself from the surrounding world. Her pale face and large, perpetually observant eyes reflect an introspection that transcends typical adolescent recalcitrance. She is passionate about urban photography, capturing details that no one else seems to notice. A crack in a station wall, the distorted reflection of a passenger in the train window. Her camera is her constant companion, a bulwark against the sensation of being invisible within her own family. Valentina perceives that her parents are perpetually preoccupied with Vittorio or their own concerns, and this wounds her more deeply than she lets on. Her paramount fear is not being seen, not being heard, drifting through life as a mere blur in someone else's photographs. As the train hurtles forward, she captures a series of landscape images, but an undercurrent of disquiet permeates her movements, as if she were seeking something within the frames, something even she cannot articulate. Vittorio, the 10-year-old youngest child, is a veritable explosion of energy. Bouncing from one seat to another, his worn sneakers thudding against the wooden floor with an erratic rhythm. His curly hair is disheveled, and his wide grin reveals a missing front tooth, lending him a mischievous air. He is obsessed with horror stories and legends, constantly imploring Odirlei to recount something frightening about the places they visit. He carries a small notebook where he sketches monsters and ghosts, Yet beneath this childlike curiosity lies a profound, primal fear of solitude. Vittorio has had nightmares where he awoke to an empty house, and ever since, he clings to his parents or sister whenever he perceives the slightest hint of insecurity. On the train, he gestures towards the mountains and asks, laughing, if minor ghosts still inhabit them. But his eyes seek Natalia's hand, as if he needs an anchor to keep from getting lost in his own somber thoughts. The dynamic among them is intricate, brimming with affection, yet also laden with unspoken tensions. Odirlei and Natalia, though bound together, bear the attrition of years of marriage, marked by silent debates about time and priorities that never fully dissipate. Odirlei yearns to be more present, but senses Natalia's judgment regarding his absences, while she, conversely, wishes he would comprehend the burden of shouldering the family's responsibilities alone. Valentina observes all this from a distance, feeling like a mere spectator in her own life, while Vittorio, with his childlike effervescence, attempts to coalesce everyone with his antics, but often only exacerbates his sister's irritation, who finds him annoying and clingy. Yet moments of tenderness punctuate their interactions. Odirlei ruffling Vittorio's hair, Natalia adjusting Valentina's jacket with an affection she fails to register. Small gestures that reveal, despite everything, their fundamental unity. As the train continues its journey, the carriage seems a microcosm of their lives, a space where each is physically present, yet emotionally disparate. Odirlei leafs through a tour guide, endeavors to plan the remainder of the day, yet their mind is elsewhere, perhaps dwelling on the business accounts left behind, or on the fervent hope that this journey might alter something between them. Natalia retrieves a bottle of hand sanitizer from her bag, cleaning her children's hands almost instinctively, while her eyes scan the carriage, as though she could anticipate any peril lurking in the shadows. Valentina snaps yet another photograph. The camera's click almost muffled by the train's clamor, yet a subtle tremor afflicts her fingers, a sensation she finds inexplicable. Vittorio, momentarily seated, sketches something in his notebook, but his hand falters, and he gazes down the carriage's vacant aisle, his brow furrowed, as if he had discerned something no one else had apprehended. The landscape outside is breathtaking, with mountains cloaked in dense vegetation and a sky of an almost ethereal blue. Yet within the carriage, the atmosphere begins to subtly shift, almost imperceptibly. The air feels denser, the sound of the tracks more acute, as though charged with an electricity that ought not to be present. Odirlei perceives a faint, tingling sensation in the pocket where he keeps the artifact, but dismisses it as mere imagination. Natalia observes Vittorio's unusual quietude, which is not his norm, and inquires if he is all right, yet he merely shakes his head, his gaze still riveted on the aisle. Valentina, reviewing a photograph on her camera's display, notices an anomalous blur in the corner of the image, something that was absent when she captured the shot. And for an instant, the train seems to decelerate, as if an unseen burden were pressing upon it, something imperceptible to anyone in the carriage, yet which all, in some ineffable manner, begin to apprehend. The historic train continues its journey through the mountains of Minas Gerais, the reverberating sound of the tracks a constant echo that ought to be comforting, yet which, by degrees, begins to morph into something more. A premonition, perhaps, or a whisper not of the living world. Within the aged wooden carriage, Odirlei's family, Natalia, Valentina, and Vittorio, still endeavors to cling to the normalcy of a holiday trip, but the initial unsettling phenomena begin to manifest, fracturing the facade of tranquility they so ardently wish to preserve. Each discerns something out of the ordinary in their own unique way, reacting accordingly, with their personalities and deepest fears, while the tension between them grows like an unyielding mist that cannot be dissipated. Odirlei, seated with his hands clasped in his lap, endeavors to maintain the composure of the pragmatic man he's always been, who invariably finds a solution. He points to a section of the landscape, commenting on the railway's history with a tone that forces enthusiasm. But his attention is interrupted by a disquieting sensation in his coat pocket. The small, twisted metal artifact he bought in Tiradentes seems to pulsate, as if imbued with a life of its own, sending a strange, tingling sensation through his hand. He removes it from his pocket for an instant, examining the object under the light streaming through the window, and notices that its surface appears rougher than before, almost as if it's eroding on its own. He laughs, trying to convince himself it's merely imagination, but his laugh comes out dry and humorless, and he quickly puts the artifact back, feeling a gnawing weight in his chest that defies logical explanation. His reaction is one of denial, typical of someone who has always relied on reason. But his eyes betray an unnerving restlessness as they scan the carriage, as if expecting to see something that shouldn't be there. Natalia, beside him, keeps her children close, her protective instinct on high alert. She's attempting to organize a snack for everyone, retrieving sandwiches from a thermal bag, but her movements are more abrupt than usual, as if she's racing against a clock she doesn't comprehend. Suddenly she stops, frowning as she notices that the temperature in the carriage seems to have plummeted, even with the sun shining brightly outside. Her first thought is practical. Perhaps a window is open, or the mountain air is colder here. But when she checks, everything is sealed shut. Then Vittorio, who was drawing in his small notebook, murmurs something that makes her freeze. "Mom, why is the train so quiet now?" Natalia realizes that the sound of the tracks, previously constant, seems to have receded, as if something is muffling the noise. Her reaction is immediate. She pulls Vittorio closer, almost crushing him against her, while her eyes seek Odirlei for an explanation she knows he doesn't possess. Her defense mechanism is control, but the sensation that something is slipping from her grasp leaves her heart pounding, the fear of not, the capacity to protect her family intensifying with each passing second. Valentina, isolated in her corner by the window, continues to photograph the landscape, but her expression shifts as she reviews the images on the camera's display. In one of the photos, a dark blur appears in the corner of the frame, something absent when she pressed the shutter. She zooms in on the image, her fingers trembling slightly, and discerns that the blur possesses vague contours, almost akin to a human silhouette, yet distorted in an utterly nonsensical manner. Her initial impulse is to delete the photograph, as if doing so could erase the sight. But something restrains her, a morbid curiosity intertwined with fear. She glances around, ensuring no one is behind her, but the carriage is otherwise empty save for her family. Her reaction is one of withdrawal, characteristic of someone who already feels invisible. She utters nothing, seeks no assistance, merely presses her headphones more firmly against her ears, as though the music's sound could somehow block out whatever is transpiring. Yet her gaze repeatedly drifts back to the camera, and her breathing grows shallower. The solitude she has perpetually felt now amplified by a pervasive sensation of being watched, by something no one else seems to perceive. Vittorio, typically an incessant fount of energy, is unusually subdued, seated beside Natalia with his notebook closed on his lap. He gazes intently down the carriage aisle, eyes wide with a look as if he beholds something imperceptible to others. "There's a voice, Mom," he whispers, almost inaudibly, yet the timbre of his voice makes Natalia shiver. "It's saying I shouldn't be here." When Natalia inquires what he means, he shakes his head, pressing himself closer to her, his small body trembling. His fear of solitude, a dread that has perpetually haunted him in nightmares, now feels more visceral than ever. He clutches his mother's hand tightly, yet his eyes remain fixed on the aisle, as if he fears that averting his gaze might allow something to draw nearer. His erstwhile playful fascination with horror stories now utterly paralyzes him, reducing him to a child who merely wishes to hide, utterly incapable of confronting whatever is whispering in his mind. The family dynamic, already fraught with subtle tensions, begins to fragment further under this nascent pressure. Odirlei, who always. He attempted to be the pillar of strength, yet feels his confidence profoundly shaken as he realizes he has no answers for what is unfolding, and his irritation mounts when Natalia fixes him with a look that seems to accuse him of inaction. He retorts with a sharper tone than he intended, dismissing it as nothing, just imagination, but his words fail to convince even himself. Natalia, meanwhile, is torn between her fierce desire to protect her children and her burgeoning frustration with Odirlei's apparent indifference, her voice growing shriller as she insists, "Something is wrong, I know it is." Valentina, observing her parents' escalating argument, retreats further into herself, feeling that even in a moment like this, no one notices her own burgeoning panic. She clutches the camera to her chest as if it were her sole defense, murmuring to herself that she must be losing her mind. Vittorio, caught between his fear and a desperate need for attention, begins to whimper softly, which only amplifies the tension between Odirlei and Natalia, who now argue over how to handle the situation, each projecting their insecurities onto the other. Meanwhile, the train itself seems to respond to this emotional disarray. The lights in the car flicker for a brief instant, an almost imperceptible flutter, but enough to make everyone pause for a second, the silence between them heavier than ever. The air feels denser, charged with something inexplicable, and the sound of the tracks, which had receded, now returns with an irregular rhythm, as if something were battering against the metal beneath the train. Odirlei attempts to stand, intending to speak with someone from the train crew, but his legs feel leaden, as if an invisible force held him rooted to the spot. Natalia clutches Vittorio even tighter, ignoring his protests that she is hurting him, while her eyes frantically scan the carriage for a threat she cannot discern. Valentina, camera still in hand, snaps another photo purely by reflex, but when she glances at the viewfinder, the blur is closer, almost at the center of the image, and she lets out a trembling gasp, burying her face in her hands. Vittorio murmurs something about the voice being louder now, and for the first time, Natalia hears a low sound, almost a whisper, emanating from the empty corridor. The normal world they knew, one made of laughter, vacation plans, and minor everyday squabbles, all are dissolving like wet paper. Each person confronts these initial signs differently, yet all experience the same sensation, an unwelcome presence, something that knows them, that understands exactly where to prod to awaken their deepest fears. The train presses onward, but for Odirlei, Natalia, Valentina, and Vittorio, the journey is no longer about reaching San Juan del Rey. It is about surviving whatever has boarded with them, something seemingly determined to grant them no peace. The historic train, winding through the mountains of Minas Gerais, no longer appears as a refuge of nostalgia or a simple holiday trip. The wooden carriage, once warmed by sunlight filtering through dusty windows, is now enveloped in an inexplicable gloom, as if the clouds outside had suddenly thickened, or as if something were siphoning the brightness from the air. The rhythmic clatter of the tracks now echoes with irregular pauses, almost as if the train itself were hesitating to press onward. For Odirlei, Natalia, Valentina, and Vittorio, their familiar world is disintegrating, and each begins a descent into their own psychological abyss, confronting fears so personal and profound that terror becomes a knife plunged directly into their most exposed vulnerabilities. Odirlei, the man who always relied on logic to confront any problem, feels his very foundation crumble. He sits with hands clenched against his knees, striving to maintain composure, but the metal artifact in his coat pocket seems to burn against his skin, even through the fabric. He retrieves it once more, and now perceives the object to be hot, almost scalding, its surface seemingly having altered again, with grooves vaguely resembling letters or symbols he cannot decipher. His mind, which had always sought rational explanations, begins to spiral into thoughts he would never utter aloud. What if this object is not merely a relic? What if he has introduced something dire into his family's proximity? The guilt he already carried for his absences as a father and husband amplifies, transforming into an overwhelming burden. He imagines that, somehow, this is his fault, that he has failed to protect them all by bringing this object into their lives. His eyes. His thoughts are fixated on his family, but he cannot speak, paralyzed by the dread that, should he open his mouth, he would confirm he has irrevocably lost control of everything. For Odirlei, the terror isn't merely the unknown. It's the escalating certainty that he isn't strong enough to safeguard those he holds dearest. And each pulsation of the artifact feels like a stark reminder of his utter powerlessness. Natalia, by his side, is in a state of heightened alert bordering on panic, though she attempts to mask it with methodical movements, tidying things around her as if such actions could impose order on the profound internal chaos she perceives. She keeps Vittorio pressed against her, almost stifling him in an embrace that offers more solace to her than to him. The air in the carriage seems to grow colder by the minute, and she shudders with chills entirely unrelated to the ambient temperature. Her paramount fear, that of failing to protect her family, manifests in swift, terrifying visions that assault her mind. She envisions losing her children in the blink of an eye, seeing them torn from her by something she is utterly powerless to combat. Every unfamiliar sound in the carriage, a creak of wood, a whisper that might merely be the wind, sends her heart racing, and she begins to question her own sanity. Is she merely imagining things, or did she truly hear something stirring in the corridor? Her ingrained need for control, which had always served as her anchor, now suffocates her. For the more she endeavors to grasp everything, the more it feels as though it's slipping irrevocably away. For Natalia, terror is epitomized by loss, by the harrowing inability to anticipate the next blow, and she starts to murmur to herself, uttering disjointed words about keeping everyone safe as her eyes incessantly sweep the carriage, searching for a nameless threat. Valentina, isolated by the window, is sinking into a chasm of solitude that the pervasive terror only deepens. She hasn't released her camera since she first noticed the blur in the photographs. And now, each time she peers through the viewfinder, the distorted silhouette appears more defined, closer, as if actively traversing the images directly toward her. Her fear of being invisible, of going unnoticed by anyone, transmutes into something far more sinister. What if something does see her, something no one else perceives? What if she is the sole target of this malevolent entity? She attempts to draw attention to Natalia, but her voice emerges weak, almost inaudible, and when her mother doesn't respond, the feeling of abandonment completely engulfs her. She shrinks into her seat, headphones now dangling around her neck, useless against the sound beginning to surface in her mind. A low murmur, almost like a voice, that seems to call her name. Valentina's terror stems from the idea that she is alone in this, that no one will believe her or save her, and each click of the camera, once her refuge, now seems to draw more attention from whatever lurks in the photos. Her breathing turns shallow, and she begins to scratch her palm with her nails, a nervous habit she hadn't indulged in since childhood, as she tries to convince herself that this isn't real, even knowing, deep down, that it is. Vittorio, the youngest, is utterly transformed by fear. The boy who once bounded from seat to seat, brimming with energy and curiosity, is now huddled against Natalia, eyes wide and fixed on the empty carriage aisle. The voice he heard earlier is louder now, no longer a whisper, but a deep tone that seems to vibrate within his head, uttering things he doesn't understand, yet which fill him with dread. His fear of being alone, of waking up to find no one, materializes with every word the voice pronounces, as if it's promising he will be left behind. He tries to explain this to Natalia, but the words come out garbled, mixed with sobs, and he begins to tremble violently, clutching his mother's shirt as if it were his last line of defense. Vittorio's terror is the sensation that something wants to separate him from his family, something that calls him away, and he begins to feel that if he closes his eyes for a second, he will vanish. His monster drawings, once mere play, now seem like prophecies, and he murmurs that he doesn't want to go with them, without explaining who they are, as his small body seems to shrink even further. The tension in the carriage is palpable, an invisible current that connects everyone's fears, yet also isolates them because no one can truly reach the other. Odirlei looks at Natalia, wanting to say something to reassure her, but guilt paralyzes him, and he clutches the artifact in his pocket with greater force, as if he could crush whatever is unfolding. Natalia, consumed by her own paranoia, barely registers Vittorio's tremors or Valentina's vacant stare, fixated only on keeping everyone physically proximate, even as they emotionally unravel. Valentina, in turn, feels a burgeoning resentment towards her parents for failing to notice her panic, while Vittorio, ensnared in his own nightmare, cannot articulate a plea for help in a way anyone could comprehend. Meanwhile, the train itself seems to respond to the family's psychological disintegration. The lights flicker again, but now for longer durations, plunging the carriage into darkness for several seconds before returning, dimmer than before. The sound of the tracks transmutes into something no longer mechanical, but almost a lament, a low groan reverberating through the wooden walls. The air grows even heavier, laden with an uncanny scent, a blend of rust and damp earth that none of them can disregard. Each perceives the terror uniquely, yet all share the same chilling certainty. Something is with them in the carriage, something that knows their deepest fears and is wielding them as weapons. The descent into this psychological abyss is irreversible, and for Odirlei, Natalia, Valentina, and Vittorio, the true horror is not merely what is transpiring, but what each is transforming into in its presence. The carriage of the historic train, winding through the mountains of Minas Gerais, now seems a space divorced from reality, a place where time and the known laws of the world no longer hold sway. The gloom enveloping Odirlei, Natalia, Valentina, and Vittorio is almost palpable, as if the darkness itself were alive, pulsating with the track's erratic rhythm. The air is laden with the scent of rust, and something more ancient, more primal, causing everyone's skin to prickle. As each struggles against their own internal demons, elements of the real world begin to surface, connecting their terrifying experiences to facts and stories that render what they are enduring not merely plausible, but profoundly disquieting. These connections are not mere coincidences. They are threads weaving terror into something that could, indeed, befall anyone. Odirlei, still clutching the metal artifact he purchased in Tiradentes, begins to recall fragments of a conversation he had with the vendor, an elderly man with sunken eyes who seemed to hesitate as he handed over the object. He had mentioned, almost in a whisper, that the artifact came from an excavation near an old abandoned mine in the mountains, a place where, according to local legends, workers vanished without a trace in the early 20th century. At the time, Odirlei had dismissed the story as folklore designed to attract tourists. But now, as he felt the object pulse in his hand, he couldn't ignore the coincidence. There were actual historical records concerning these mines, documented in regional archives, which spoke of inexplicable accidents and accounts of voices heard from the depths even after operations had ceased. Over 30 men had disappeared in a single night in 1912, their bodies never found, only tools and clothing left behind, as if something had taken them. Odirlei felt a knot in his stomach at the thought that the artifact in his hands might have come from that very cursed ground, and the idea that he had brought something with him, something that should not have been unearthed, made him break out in a cold sweat, his hands trembling as he tried to decide whether to throw the object out the window or keep it, fearing that letting it go might only exacerbate the situation. Natalia, trying to keep her children close as her heart pounded, couldn't stop thinking about what she had read about this railway before the trip. She had researched the train's history as part of her vacation planning, finding it fascinating that the MariaFumaça line, constructed in the 19th century, held a sinister reputation among local residents. There were documented accounts available in old newspapers and digital archives, of frequent accidents in the 1930s, many of which defied logical explanation. One specific case remained etched in her memory, a train that derailed without apparent cause, killing all passengers but leaving the engineer alive, though he was incapable of speaking about what he had witnessed. He spent the rest of his life in an asylum, muttering about shadows on the tracks. Natalia felt a shiver as she recalled that residents of the towns along the route still avoided discussing this history, as if they feared attracting the attention of something. Now, as the train car seemed to tremble abnormally, she wondered if she was experiencing something similar, if what she was feeling, the inexplicable cold, the sounds that shouldn't be there, was part of a story that should never have been forgotten. His fear of failing to protect his family intensifies with the chilling notion that forces beyond his comprehension might be at play. Entities that have already claimed lives along this very path. Valentina, hunched over her camera, finds herself compulsively reviewing the photographs she's taken, even as each image fills her with dread. The blur she previously observed is sharper in some shots, and she discerns that the distorted silhouette appears in different positions, as if shifting between frames. This brings to mind something she'd studied in a documentary on paranormal phenomena, a documented case of haunted photographs from Brazil in the 1970s. An amateur photographer in a town not far from here had captured images of figures not present at the moment of the shutter's release, figures that, according to witnesses, seemed to shift within the photographs over time. The images were analyzed by specialists. While many dismissed them as hoaxes, others pointed to inexplicable interferences on the film. The photographer vanished months later, leaving behind only his camera, which, according to accounts, continued to capture images autonomously. Valentina feels her stomach churn at the thought that her own camera might be capturing something similar, something that resists being seen, yet insists on manifesting itself to her. Her fear of being invisible intertwines with the terror of being the sole perceiver of this presence, and she begins to question whether deleting the photos would make a difference, or if it's already too late, if what's captured in the images has already marked her in some indelible way. Vittorio, still trembling in Natalia's arms, ceaselessly murmurs about the voice he hears, a voice that now seems clearer, almost forming phrases he desperately wishes not to comprehend. His words prompt Natalia to recall something her grandmother, a woman who grew up in a town near this very railway, used to recount: tales of voices in the mountains. Her grandmother spoke of children who, upon traversing certain areas, would hear calls that adults failed to perceive, calls that led them to become lost in the forests or to vanish without a trace. There are historical records of such occurrences, documented in police reports from the turn of the last century, detailing children who disappeared during train journeys or mountain treks, often found days later in a state of profound shock, unable to explain what happened, yet consistently speaking of guiding voices. Vittorio, with his profound fear of solitude, appears to be experiencing something that resonates with these narratives, and Natalia feels a mounting despair as she realizes her son might be hearing something beyond mere imagination, something deeply rooted in a dark past she is powerless to confront. The terror of losing Vittorio to this voice compels her to embrace him even more tightly, even as he struggles, insisting, "She's not leaving, Mom. She's here." These tangible connections to reality render the family's current ordeal even more terrifying, for they are not merely internal fears or illusions. There is a historical context, documented facts, and accounts suggesting that what is unfolding within the carriage is neither novel nor isolated. Odirlei gazes at the artifact in his hand, sensing that he holds a fragment of accursed history he should never have disturbed. Natalia stares down the carriage corridor, envisioning shadows on the tracks akin to those described in ancient accounts. Valentina clutches her camera, aware that what she perceives in the photographs possesses precedents that no one has managed to elucidate. Vittorio weeps softly, his voice intertwining with the sound only he can hear. an echo of something that has claimed others before him. The train presses onward, yet for this family every kilometer traversed seems to propel them deeper into a past that was never truly interred, a past lying in wait to claim new passengers. The terror is no longer merely personal, it is historical, deeply rooted in something far grander than themselves, something that has transcended generations and has now found them, as if it knew they were coming. The historic train car, lost amidst the mountains of Minas Gerais, is no longer merely a means of transport. It is transmuted into a prison of wood and iron, where the air feels suffocating, laden with a weight that transcends the physical. The encroaching darkness outside has swallowed the landscapes that once offered solace, and the lights within the carriage flicker erratically, casting shadows that seem to possess an autonomous movement. The sound of the tracks is now a dissonant roar, as if something were clawing at the metal from beneath, desperate to gain entry. For Odirlei, Natalia, Valentina, and Vittorio, this represents the moment of peak tension, the apex of their personal terrors, where each confronts impossible decisions that test the very limits of their minds and hearts. Horror is no longer merely a presence, it is a potent force compelling them to confront the worst of themselves, leaving indelible scars that none of them will ever erase. Odirlei teeters on the brink of his sanity, the metal artifact in his hand now so searingly hot it scorches his skin, yet he cannot release it, as if his fingers are fused to the object by an unseen force. He feels every pulsation of the artifact like a heartbeat, and the consuming guilt, the realization that he brought this upon his family, erupts into visceral despair. He hears a sound emanating from the object, a guttural whisper that seems to coalesce into words, something about returning and paying, and his mind verges on collapse with the decision he must make, to hurl the artifact through the window, risking something far worse, or to keep it, knowing he is nourishing whatever entity resides within. His gaze locks onto Natalia and their children, and the terror of failing as their protector paralyzes him. He imagines that if he relinquishes the object, he might lose everything, but if he retains it, he might be condemning himself. The gravitas of the choice makes him tremble, and he begins to murmur incoherent apologies, tears streaming down his face as the artifact seems to tighten its grip further on his hand, as if alive, as if it knows he lacks the resolve to decide. Odirlei's zenith of terror is this absolute powerlessness, the crushing realization that no matter what he does, he has already failed, and the price will be exacted from those he loves. Natalia, clutching Vittorio with a force bordering on violence, is succumbing to a panic that strips her of any vestige of control. The chill in the carriage is now unbearable, and she feels something brush against the nape of her neck, a light touch like icy fingers. Yet when she turns, there is nothing there. Her greatest fear, that of losing her family, crystallizes into a horrific vision that invades her mind. She sees Vittorio and Valentina being dragged into the corridor's darkness, their screams echoing as they vanish, and she cannot reach them. The decision she confronts is brutal: to release Vittorio to check on Valentina, risking that something might seize him, or to keep him tethered to her, ignoring the boy's whimpers of pain and her daughter's desperate glances. Every choice feels wrong, each one laden of consequences she cannot bear. Terror sends her into hyperventilation, and she begins to sway back and forth, murmuring that she will keep everyone safe, even as Vittorio cries out in pain and Valentina glares at her, eyes brimming with resentment. Natalia's breaking point is the certainty that she cannot protect everyone, that her need for control is consuming her, and the icy touch on her nape seems to mock her weakness, as if it knows she has already lost the battle. Valentina, huddled in her seat, is utterly consumed by the horror her camera unveils. She can no longer tear her gaze from the photos, and now the blurred silhouette is no longer just a shape. It is a figure, indistinct yet distinctly human, with eyes that seem fixed on her through the viewfinder. With each image she reviews, the figure draws nearer, and in the last photo, it appears to be mere feet away, almost within arm's reach. Her fear of being invisible transmutes into the terror of being seen by something that should not exist. And the decision she faces is devastating. To continue looking, confronting whatever is approaching, or to drop the camera, knowing it might mean severing the only link she has to the real world. She hears a sound emanating from the device, a soft click, as if it were taking pictures on its own. And when she glances at the viewfinder again, the figure is even closer, its eyes now visible, vacant, yet brimming with intent. Terror forces a choked cry from her, and she clutches the camera to her chest, unable to release it, even as she feels herself being drawn into something she cannot comprehend. Valentina's breaking point is the sensation that there is no escape, that she has been chosen by something that perceives her in a way no one else does, and each beat of her heart seems to echo the camera's click, as if counting down the seconds until the inevitable. Vittorio, ensnared in Natalia's arms, is in a state of pure desperation, his small body trembling as the voice in his head becomes unbearably loud. It is no longer a whisper, it is a command, an imperative to come, to leave them, and he feels a force tugging at him, as if invisible hands are trying to wrench him from his mother. His fear of being alone materializes in the vision of being taken to a dark place where he will never see his family again, and the dilemma confronting him is harrowing for a child. To resist the voice, even if it entails enduring greater pain, or to yield, hoping for its cessation. He sobs aloud now, shrieking that he doesn't want to go, as his small hands desperately grasp at Natalia, yet the force tugging him feels insurmountable, and he perceives his feet skittering across the carriage floor as though something were inexorably dragging him away. Vittorio's ultimate terror culminates in the sensation of being severed, of the voice triumphing, and his shrieks meld with the clatter of the tracks, forging a cacophony of despair that saturates the carriage. The train itself seems to acknowledge this emotional climax, as the lights extinguish entirely for several seconds, plunging the family into absolute darkness, where the sole audible sounds are their ragged breaths and Vittorio's distressed whimpers. When illumination eventually returns, it is diminished, almost vermilion, and the scent of rust and damp earth has become utterly stifling. The carriage lurches violently as if something external were assailing it, and the rhythm of the tracks metamorphoses into a metallic shriek that eerily resembles a human cry. Each individual confronts their personal terror at its precipice, their impossible choices tearing them asunder emotionally. Odirlei, immobilized by guilt, cannot relinquish the artifact. Natalia, ravaged by impotence, is at a loss as to whom to rescue. Valentina, scarred by her observations, cannot forsake her camera, and Vittorio, petrified by the voice, finds himself powerless to resist its summons. The acme of terror is not merely the external unfolding events, but the internal fracturing within each individual, the irreparable fissures in their very souls, as the train relentlessly forges onward, hurtling them towards a destiny none can fathom. The historic train carriage, still traversing the mountains of Minas Gerais, appears to have transmuted into something far more than a mere physical space. It is now a liminal realm where time warps and reality disintegrates into nightmarish fragments. The lights, which previously flickered erratically, now barely function, casting a feeble, jaundiced glow that scarcely illuminates the ashen faces of Odirlei, Natalia, Valentina, and Vittorio. The rhythmic clatter of the tracks has resumed its steady cadence, yet an unsettling dissonance pervades it, an unnatural echo, as though something as if it were accompanying the train just below or alongside, unseen, yet palpable. The terror that consumed them at the zenith of their ordeal did not dissipate. It solidified, leaving indelible marks on each of them. The family that boarded this train no longer exists. What remains are shattered versions of themselves, irrevocably transformed by a horror that not only tested them but redefined them in profound ways. Odirlei sits hunched, the metal artifact still clutched in his hand, though now it feels cold, inert, as if its purpose has been fulfilled. The guilt that once gnawed at him has transmuted into a somber acceptance. a conviction that he failed as a protector and that the cost of this will be borne forever. He can no longer meet Natalia's or the children's gaze without feeling a vice-like grip on his chest, a physical ache that reminds him of his utter powerlessness. His logic, once his unwavering anchor, has been utterly shattered. He now scrutinizes every decision he ever made, every choice that led him to acquire that accursed object. The transformation in Odirlei is profound. The confident, rational man has given way to a haunted individual who perceives shadows in every corner and feels the oppressive weight of something unseen upon his shoulders. He murmurs to himself, disconnected words about returning and paying, as if trapped in a conversation no one else can hear. The price he paid was not merely emotional. There is an opacity in his gaze, suggesting that a part of him was left behind, perhaps still clinging to the artifact, even as his hands now hold it without conviction. He is no longer the father who promised to fix everything. He is a broken man who fears that the worst is yet to unfold. Natalia, with Vittorio still clinging to her, refuses to release her son, even as her arms tremble from sheer exhaustion. The panic that once consumed her has transmuted into an unyielding obsession to keep everyone close at any cost. Her fear of losing her family has not diminished. On the contrary, it has become so deeply ingrained that she now perceives threats in every movement, every sound. She no longer trusts Odirlei to protect them, and her eyes, once brimming with maternal concern, now betray a distrust that verges on paranoia. The transformation in Natalia is agonizing. The woman who meticulously planned perfect vacations and sought equilibrium in family life has become a mere shell of herself, someone perpetually vigilant, who neither sleeps nor relaxes. The toll she paid was her peace of mind. She can no longer feel secure, not even during moments of repose. Every creak of the railcar makes her shudder, and she clutches Vittorio more tightly, disregarding his whimpers of discomfort, as if releasing him would condemn her to lose him forever. There is a newfound frigidity in her demeanor, an emotional chasm that separates her even from Valentina, as if the terror had instilled in her the conviction that loving too deeply is perilous, that attachment is an open invitation to loss. Valentina, seated alone with the camera in her lap, is no longer the teenager who sought validation through her photographs. The horror she confronted upon seeing the specter in the images has transmuted her into someone who dreads her own perceptions. She no longer touches the camera, yet finds herself unable to relinquish it, as if it were an inseparable facet of her being that cannot be abandoned, despite the terror it evokes. Her former fear of invisibility has metastasized into something far more insidious, a profound dread of being seen by something that ought not to exist, something that has branded her in a manner she cannot fathom. Valentina's transformation is silent, yet utterly devastating. She is withdrawn even further, speaking sparingly, avoiding eye contact, as though fearing that even a glance at another might betray the horrors she witnessed. The cost she incurred was her fundamental trust in the world. She now lives with the incessant sensation of being observed, even in solitude. Her fingers tremble as they approach the camera, and she murmurs to herself, "I won't look again." But her gaze invariably gravitates back to the device, as if compelled by an unseen summons. The adolescent, once brimming with dreams of capturing the world through her lenses, now bears a profound void, an indelible conviction that there are entities that should remain unseen, and that she, by some unwitting act, had beckoned them into her existence. Vittorio, still cradled in Natalia's arms, has ceased his crying, but the eerie silence that now envelops him is more profoundly terrifying than his preceding wails. The voice he heard is no longer present, or at least he no longer perceives it. But his fear of solitude has transmuted into an unnerving apathy for a child of his tender age. He no longer responds to his mother's touch, nor does he seek solace. Merely he gazes into the void with glazed eyes, as if perceiving something invisible to others. Vittorio's transformation is perhaps the most tragic. The child, brimming with energy and imagination, has been supplanted by someone who appears to have forsaken the fight, who has accepted that something desires him and will, sooner or later, claim him. The price he paid was his innocence, his capacity to trust the world around him. He no longer speaks of the voice, yet sometimes his lips move soundlessly, as if in silent response to something. Natalia attempts to coax him into speaking, but he merely shakes his head, and there is an unnerving depth in his gaze that suggests he possesses knowledge unbeknownst to others, something that has irrevocably altered him. The train presses onward, yet the carriage feels smaller, more oppressive, as if its walls are slowly constricting around them. The scent of rust and damp earth lingers, and the sound of the tracks carries a palpable weight none of them can disregard. The family remains physically bound, yet emotionally fragmented, each ensnared within their own prison of trauma. Odirlei bears guilt like an invisible shackle. Natalia drowns in her paranoia. Valentina dreads the unseen, and Vittorio seems to have forfeited a part of himself to something that beckoned him. The psychological scars are etched upon their faces, in their gestures, in the way they eschew prolonged touch or eye contact. The horror they endured did not culminate with the climax. It has settled into their lives, fundamentally altering who they are in a manner none of them can undo. The toll was steep, paid not in blood, but in fragments of their very souls. And as the train advances through the mountains, each silently wonders if the true terror lies not in what they have survived, but in what still awaits them, now that they are no longer who they once were. The historic train, still winding its way through the dark mountains of Minas Gerais, appears to have become an entity unto itself, a space where time no longer adheres to normal rules and the air bears a suffocating weight. The lights within the carriage are all but extinguished, casting only a dim, anemic glow upon the exhausted faces of Odirlei, Natalia, Valentina, and Vittorio. The sound of the tracks, once a dissonant roar, is now a constant, almost hypnotic murmur, yet something about it feels profoundly amiss. An echo that seems to form indistinct words, like a whisper no one dares to acknowledge. The horror that transformed them has not ended. It has left a trail, an indelible mark, and as the train continues its journey, a disquieting revelation emerges, connecting this family's torment to something far grander, something that leaves them, and anyone who hears their story, with the pervasive sense that the nightmare is only just beginning. Odirlei, still clutching the metal artifact with trembling hands, finds himself unable to avert his gaze from it, even as his mind screams at him to release it. The object, which moments ago pulsed with an inexplicable energy, now appears inert. Yet something new, something he hadn't noticed before, catches his eye. A minuscule, almost imperceptible inscription etched into its base. He leans closer, eyes narrowed, and discerns numbers, a sequence that offers no immediate meaning but sends a shiver down his spine. He murmurs the numbers to himself, as if attempting to decipher them, and then, in a flash of memory, recalls something he overheard at the market where he purchased it. A tale of such objects, inscribed with codes denoting their origin, a place deep in the mountains where strange occurrences had transpired for decades. The revelation strikes him with the force of a blow. This artifact is not merely a cursed item, it is a key, a beacon to something far greater, perhaps an invitation to a place he should never have approached. The enduring impact of this is a paranoia that settles deep within his chest, the chilling certainty that, by touching this object, he has not only ushered horror into his family's lives, but has also irrevocably linked them to something that will not rest until it claims them. His eyes turn to the window, where the darkness seems to thicken, as if watching him in return, and he senses that the train is not merely following a track, but is being inexorably drawn to some destination he dreads to discover. Natalia, with Vittorio still clinging to her, does not perceive Odirlei's obsession with the artifact. Yet she senses an undeniable shift in the atmosphere, a tension that has not abated even after the worst of their ordeal seemed to pass. She attempts to soothe her son, stroking his hair, but her own fingers tremble, and her mind cannot shake the chilling conviction that something still pursues them. As she subtly adjusts Vittorio's position, she notices something on his hand. A small, almost imperceptible scratch, but oddly shaped, as if it were part of a design or symbol. She frowned, tracing the mark with her finger, and Vittorio, who had been silent, let out a low groan, almost a whimper, as if the touch pained him more than it should. The disquieting revelation caught her off guard. This mark hadn't been there before, and she had no idea how or when it had appeared. Its impact added a new layer of dread. The notion that the horror they had endured had left not only emotional scars, but something physical. Something that perhaps meant Vittorio had been branded by whatever had sought to claim him. She clutched her son tightly, her heart pounding as her eyes swept the train car, as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. The pervasive sense that they weren't free, that something still laid claim to them, consumed her, and she wondered if this mark was merely the harbinger of something worse. Valentina, huddled in her seat with the camera in her lap, didn't touch the device, yet her eyes kept returning to it as if drawn by a magnet. She tried to focus on anything else, the rhythmic clatter of the tracks, her mother's face, but something pulled her back, a morbid curiosity she couldn't quell. With hesitant hands, she picked up the camera, and against every instinct, turned on the display to check the last photo she had taken. What she saw made her freeze. The blurred figure, which had previously been mere feet away, was no longer there. But in the corner of the image, something new had appeared. An almost imperceptible reflection in the train car window, as if something was outside, looking in. The revelation was a blow to her chest. Whatever she had captured hadn't vanished, merely shifted its position, perhaps awaiting the opportune moment. Its lasting impact was a feeling of absolute vulnerability, the certainty that no matter where she went, something saw her, something followed her through the very lenses she had once cherished. She abruptly turned off the camera, but couldn't release it, as if it were tethered to her in a way she couldn't comprehend. Her eyes fixed on the window, where the reflection from the photo seemed to reiterate itself in the darkness, and she felt a shiver unrelated to the carriage's chill. Whatever is out there, or whatever it may be, hasn't finished with her. Vittorio, in Natalia's arms, remains in a disquieting silence, but his eyes, previously glazed over, now seem fixated on something no one else perceives. He doesn't react to his mother's touch or the mark on his hand, but suddenly, in an almost inaudible whisper, he utters something that chills Natalia's blood. "It's waiting for us to stop." The phrase is spoken with a calm that is unnatural for a child, as if he possessed knowledge unknown to others, as if he had gleaned it from another source. The unsettling revelation is a gut punch to all who hear it. Vittorio somehow is still connected to whatever called him, and his words suggest that the horror hasn't concluded, that a purpose, a fate, awaits. The impact of this sends a wave of despair through the family, the notion that whatever has tormented them is merely biding its time to strike again. Vittorio says nothing further, retreating into his silence, but his eyes remain fixed on an invisible point, as if he were witnessing something approach. The train decelerates at the abandoned station, its wheels groaning against the tracks like a lament echoing through the mountains. The dim lights of the moss-covered platform barely illuminate the contours of what was once a place of arrivals and departures, but now resembles a graveyard of forgotten dreams. Odirlei clutches the metal artifact to his chest, the numbers engraved on its base burning in his mind like a sentence he still doesn't fully comprehend. He knows, with a certainty that terrifies him, that these digits are more than a mere marking. They are coordinates, an invitation, a map to something that should have remained buried in the mountains. Natalia, with Vittorio still clinging to her body, cannot tear her eyes away from the mysterious mark on her son's hand. A small, symbol-shaped scar that wasn't there when the day began. She traces her finger over the mark, and Vittorio shudders but doesn't pull away, as if he has accepted that he now bears something that cannot be removed. The The mother, who had always meticulously planned every detail of her family life, comes to understand that there are no plans for this. No manual exists to instruct how to protect a child from something that has scarred them so intimately and permanently. Valentina, huddled in her seat, clutches the camera as if it were a talisman that has lost its power. She no longer needs to look at the photos to know that the figure is there, waiting, observing through the lenses that once offered her refuge. Her fingers tremble around the device, and she feels that no matter where she goes, the images will follow her, bearing the proof that not everything can be explained, that some things choose to be seen only by those who have been marked. And Vittorio, cradled in Natalia's trembling arms, shatters the silence with a whisper that slices through the air like a blade. The station, that's where they wait. His words, uttered with a serenity unbefitting a child, send a chill down everyone's spine. He offers no explanation as to who they are, but his eyes, fixed on the darkness beyond the window, suggest he knows far more than a 10-year-old child ever should. The train grinds to a complete halt, the rhythmic clatter of the tracks dissolving into a heavy silence that seems to drain the air from the carriage. Through the window, the abandoned station reveals itself in its entirety. Cracked platforms, benches overgrown with vegetation, and a faded sign none of them can decipher in the gloom. But there is something more, something stirring in the shadows among the ancient pillars, something that seems to have been awaiting them since the moment they boarded. The lasting impact of this experience is not merely the trauma each carries. It is the chilling certainty that horror found within them something it recognized, something that linked them to a past not their own, but which now lays claim to them. Odirlei's artifact, Vittorio's mark, Valentina's photographs, Natalia's paranoia, all are threads in a web that binds them to something greater, something that transcends this journey and stretches into the future in ways they do not yet comprehend. And you? Which member of this family has most deeply permeated your thoughts? Was it Odirlei's devastating guilt, a man who bears the burden of having brought evil close to those he loves most? Natalia's suffocating despair, a mother who has discovered she cannot to protect your family from everything? What about Valentina's silent terror, a teenager who became visible to something that shouldn't exist? Or perhaps the disquieting silence of Vittorio, a child who knows more than he should about things adults cannot comprehend? Leave your comment below. If you were in that train car at the height of terror, when every second felt like an eternity and each breath could be your last, what choice would you make? Would you follow Odirlei and attempt to confront the unknown with logic? Would you cling to your loved ones like Natalia, even knowing it might not be enough? Would you isolate yourself like Valentina, hoping the horror passes unnoticed? Or would you accept the summons like Vittorio, surrendering to the inevitable? This family will never be the same after what they endured on that train, and perhaps neither will you, now that you know the secrets they carry. If the psychological horror that springs from our deepest fears, feeds on our profoundest vulnerabilities, and compels us to confront what we prefer to conceal utterly fascinates you, then subscribe to the Portal of Dread. The next family we will encounter bears traumas that might precisely mirror those you attempt to forget, fears that echo your own nightmares, and secrets that may unveil truths about your very nature. Activate notifications and prepare to discover the extent to which your mind can stretch when confronted with the impossible, the inexplicable, with that which challenges everything you believe about reality. Because, ultimately, we all carry something dark that we prefer to keep buried. The true question is, what transpires when this something finds us? When it decides the time has come to exact the price for what we've tried to forget. The train may have reached the end of its journey, but the story of Odirlei, Natalia, Valentina, and Vittorio, that is only just beginning. And who knows, the next stop might be closer to you than you imagine.